Hello and welcome to World Bank Live. I'm Paul Blake in Washington, D.C. Coming up over the next half hour.
It's been about a year since COVID-19 entered the scene, ending and upending millions of lives and forcing societal lockdowns on an unprecedented scale. For students in most every country, the Great Lockdown has meant a lockout from classrooms. My colleagues here at the Bank calculated that at the height of this education crisis, the worst in a century, more than 160 countries had mandated some form of school closures, affecting at least 1.5 billion children and youth. Many of the effects are obvious, yet many more will only be known and felt in the decades to come. But in crisis, there's also opportunity to transform and reimagine education and realize what our experts are calling the future of learning. Now, over the next half hour, we'll be live in Lima, Peru, and Freetown, Sierra Leone, as we take stock of the effects of the Great Lockdown on education and students. We'll be asking how the lessons learned over the past year could actually accelerate a transformation of education that could benefit generations to come.
So now let me bring in the World Bank's Global Director for Education. Down the line from Lima, Peru is Jaime Saavedra, and down the line from Freetown in Sierra Leone is His Excellency David Singay, the Minister for Basic and Secondary Education for the government of Sierra Leone. Gentlemen, welcome to you both.
Good morning, Paul.
Good morning. Well, Jaime, we spoke last year here on World Bank Live. I think it was in April, just as the crisis was really hitting a peak. And in some parts of the world, we were starting to see some infection rates come under control, seeing that curve get flattened a bit, at least for the first time. Since then, we've had this second wave in many parts of the world. What has been the impact? Give us an update. What's been the impact of the second wave on education and learning around the world?
Thanks for the question, Paul. And you're right, it's almost been a year, and it's great to see David here as well, with whom we have been sharing thoughts about the magnitude of this crisis. I think we were hinting at that some months ago, but unfortunately, we can say, I think at this stage, that we're living the worst education crisis of the last century, with this twin shock of very extended lockdowns in many parts of the world, basically in all school systems, and at the same time, a very the most serious economic crisis, right, of the last decades, which is hitting all public budgets and also family budgets. And our fear is not only that, this is having a huge impact in terms of learning of students, in terms of nutrition, in terms of emotional well-being of children and young people, but also a huge worry is how unequal this crisis is, because all countries have done their best and tried to implement remote learning interventions, combining radio, TV, the internet as much as possible, although in some countries the rate of penetration is low, but trying to do as much as they can. But obviously any type of remote learning does not replace presential education. And actually the specific experience of many children has been very different, but very different across, within countries, right? So our rich children or something from a relatively a richer background, right? Maybe had access to internet, could interact with teachers and students, have books at home, have a space to work. And in the other extreme, you have a rural child, right, that at most can have access to a TV, and there's many kids in the same dwelling, so there's no space to work, and everything in between. But actually, that's what's the most worrisome, or one of the key worrisome aspects of this crisis, how unequal this impact might be. So really huge homework, right, for all of us.
That was my big takeaway from our conversation back in April, was how the digital divide becomes an educational divide, and that's just one of the aspects of this crisis. And you're giving us this sort of macro view, a global view there. David, can you give us the view from Sierra Leone? This is the first time you and I have spoken. How has the pandemic, how has this crisis affected students in your country, in Sierra Leone?
I think it's it's twofold. I mean, a lot of it is linked with what Jaime was saying, and in parts, these challenges are even more worse in rural areas and in areas where the infrastructure was not there. But in Sierra Leone, we're lucky, and I put lucky in quotes, because the ministry was a little bit prepared from our Ebola experience. So during Ebola, schools were closed for about a year. And during that period, we revamped and launched the radio teaching program. The schooling was going through on radio and TV. And so when it was on the first confirmation of COVID in Sierra Leone this time, we're already well in advance preparing for radio teaching program. And this time we expanded it through community radios. We invested in buying transmission with our partners as well to new districts. And we will continue doing that, not just in prepared in emergency, but one of the investments that we want to focus on moving forward is ensuring that the radio teaching program and the education radio is accessible for everyone, for remediation, which we know was already an issue because the kids in remote areas don't have access to teachers. And it's for continuous learning. And when we launched the Education Emergency Task Force, we had about 4 pillars for communications, risk communications, and just engagement with people, continuous distance learning, the radio teaching program, and then school reopening readiness. We reopened schools in July for those who were taking transition exams. In class 6, junior secondary school and senior secondary school, about 420,000 kids. And those guys came for 5 weeks and they took exams and they've been able to transition. So that was very good. Everybody else came back to school in October 5th. But the biggest challenge, from Ebola, we'd also seen, and we've seen this across the world actually. In Kenya, there are many reports of this, and in other parts of the world where girls get pregnant. A lot of the people who get left behind when schools close is girls. In a recent survey, a rapid assessment survey by World Bank and UNICEF in Sierra Leone showed that about 76% of kids who were surveyed were helping with household chores, right, and spending less time on studying. This means that when schools reopen, it will be difficult for them to transition from being household help and to back to school. And for the girls who got pregnant in the past, they stayed out of school. But this time, Cabinet overturned the 10-year ban that had prevented girls from going to school. And we launched a radical inclusion policy that we can talk about a lot. But it really was that schools closed. And we saw that the people who are most left behind are with disabilities and those who are in remote areas. And we have seen that the poor rural girl from a single home with a disability is the most marginalized person. And the question really is, how do we ensure that that girl, the profile of that person, is able to access and continue school even during the pandemic?
Mm-hmm. And it sounds to me like the previous public health crisis, that of the Ebola crisis in 2014, 2015, that gave you sort of a playbook by which to respond to the new threat, the COVID-19 threat. I want to ask Jaime, you're looking at various school systems, the school systems in countries around the world. Something you've probably been looking to is these various ways to mitigate the effects of COVID-19. Could the pandemic and the experience of the pandemic, could it accelerate a transformation of education that could benefit the next generation and students once they're back in classrooms around the world?
I think we have two big challenges at this stage. The first challenge is how to manage this process, how to manage the pandemic. The second challenge will be to use this window of opportunity for the transformation that many systems have to go through. But let me start just mention a few issues first of what is that we need to do in the coming weeks and months, right? And I think we need to build on many of the lessons that this pandemic has already taught us. One is that, as you were saying before, we need to close the digital divide. We need to continue working and investing much more on our teachers. But we, in the very short run, we need to manage this complex process, right? It's not that the pandemic, once the vaccine comes and is rolled out, then everything it's finished, and we just go back to what we were doing before, and maybe try to improve, right? Unfortunately, we will have to live with this pandemic for this 2021, right? And maybe parts of 2022, we're not going to see a massive vaccination in all countries very quickly. So most education systems across the world will have to manage and live with this virus, right? And that will imply that then we will have to balance these two huge risks. Well, we need to balance the health risk and at the same time recognize the huge losses, right, that our kids are having, our young people and our children. Hence, countries will have to be extremely creative, right? Some education systems have been able to go back, as in the case of Sierra that David was describing. Other systems have not gone back, right? Are still in the case of Latin America and some parts of South Asia. You're talking about basically the whole school year of 2020 lost, right? More than 180 days lost of presential school. So now each country will have to be very creative, will require a lot of social maturity, right? Because we'll need to check how are infection rates in the different countries, try to open as much as we can. In some cases, you will not be able to open and will need to continue with the remote only. But then once the systems start reopening because infection rates go down, then one of the first things that should reopen are schools, right? However, when we say let's reopen the school, it's not the school as we know it, right? It's a school in which you need to follow all the sanitary protocols. You need to probably it's going to be fewer days, smaller classes. Some of the older teachers will not be able to go back, right? And maybe you'll have to close again a few months later. We don't know, right? So this will require a lot of creativity, a lot of flexibility, right? And a huge joint work, right? A real joint work between communities, parents, teachers, education authorities, right? And that will, as we do that, we will have to set the stage, right, to really build forward, right, more resilient systems, right, and more equitable systems, right, in which we really don't have these unequal patterns that David was describing so precisely for the case of Sierra Leone, but actually that's what we see in many countries, right?
And I want to come back to that idea and the topic of sanitation and how do you reopen schools safely. But just briefly, before we get too far away from technology and the effect of the crisis, David, could you talk a little bit about how you all in Sierra Leone have been able to leverage technology to mitigate some of the worst effects of the learning crisis? How have you used technology? What's been the most challenging? Talk to us a little bit about that.
I think we use it a couple different ways. One is a lot of what we've done actually is, I also serve as Chief Innovation Officer, and I lead the Directorate of Science, Technology, and Innovation. So we're a little bit lucky that I get to be in charge of a portfolio for innovation and education at the same time. So we then get to use technology, and one of the partnerships we had was with Coursera, where we focused on, I think, about 3,500 courses we made available to students across Sierra Leone for free, and for 50,000 people. And we set up partnerships with the MNOs, with the telecommunication folks, such that kids who are accessing digital platforms and online education platforms can be zero rated, and so it can be cost free. And the radio itself, radio is technology, and one of the things that we did in really remote areas, and I often joked that paper is such a great technology that we don't even think about it as technology, but we brought paper materials and support materials to places where there was no radio connectivity or mobile services. And one of the things that we just did now actually was through the World Bank, and this is something we've been doing over the last couple of years. Our annual school census is digitized, and this year we decided that we should go a step further. We'll provide the tablets to all the senior secondary schools, such that the principals will provide the data in real time, and this is data on school attendance, enrollment, teachers, furniture, everything, sanitation, and we're really trying to see how we can get real-time data from the schools. And we insisted that we had to do an annual school census even when schools were for last year, because we don't want to skip that. We've been doing it now for a while. because we have data on geospatial where the schools are, and with our partners, Grade 3, we did a population distribution output work where we can calculate how many kids are in school or out of school just based on how close are people from school. So the distance kids have to work to be able to go to public schools, go to private school, and we did those analysis. And we invited other partners like the EdTech Hub, who are working again with the Teaching Service Commission and World Bank to develop real concrete tools for in-service teacher training for how we continuous professional development. And just last week, we launched something that I think is really, really cool through support from GPE. GPE gave about 70K or 75K to countries to help with planning. And we used, when COVID started, and we used that money to build a dictionary in your hand, the service where anybody, anywhere can take your phone, SMS, USSD, which is free. About 87% of the population has access to mobile connectivity. And you can check up a word. And we many now it's common. We don't even think about it because if you don't know a word, you Google search it. I grew up reading a dictionary for fun, and it is about literacy and the core and access to a dictionary is so fundamental, but we take it for granted. And so we created a solution just now that brings a dictionary to anybody anywhere in Sierra as long as you have a mobile phone and you can have connectivity, you can search up the meaning of any word. And we're trying to expand that to French as well. And you can sign up for a word of the day. So there are multiple layers from paper to mobile to web. And this is in line with our National Innovation Strategy, which came out of the STI. One of the principles there is mobile first and hybrid technology. So everything we do has to work on mobile, and it has to be able to work online and offline, on paper and web and devices.
I'm struck by the phrase that sort of crisis creates opportunity. And Jaime, David there was talking about kind of the various ways they've innovated during the crisis. Can you talk maybe in broader strokes globally about how this crisis might be sort of laying the foundation for innovation in education, some of the positives, some of the silver linings that there might be for the future of education?
Look, David has outlined with very concrete examples, I mean, many ways through which technology can be critical. First, to manage the system better, right? To know exactly where is each kid in which school with which teacher, right? And what are they? How much progress is happening? Technology, as he was given concrete examples, can provide better tools that can be used in the classroom and tools that can be in the hands of children. But in a way, those are examples of in which way the future has been propelled to today. But actually, what we and this is I think a good as you say, in a silver lining, right? There's an opportunity on a crisis. I think the art in the near future would be precisely finding that balance between technology and the human factor, right? As we have been discussing, one of the other lessons of this pandemic is showing us that really the school is a fundamental factor in the lives of children, right? The school is not only where you learn, math and science and how to read, but it's also you learn how to be a good citizen, right? You learn about empathy, you learn about caring about others.
Social skills.
You learn all your social, we call them sometimes, 21st century skills, but actually those are the skills that everyone needs for life, right? And those you learn in that interaction, in that magic of the interaction between the teacher and the student and with your peers, right? But at the same time, we have all these technological tools, right? The key issue for the near future would be how do we make sure that these tools then enhance the human factor, enhance the role of the teachers, right? Who have to be those great coaches, mentors, right? Inspirers, right? Of students in the future that we're living today, right? So there's one lesson, right? That as you were hinting at, that we need to close the digital divide, right? Why? Because of the many examples that David was mentioning. We need to continue investing in our teachers, right? Because they play a fundamental role in a process that is fundamentally social, right? Education is a social endeavor. But third, and there's one third critical lesson of this pandemic everywhere in the world, is that hopefully, right, there's a better understanding of parents, right, about the importance of education, about the critical role of teachers, and about the critical role that they themselves play in the future of their children, right? When we say that we'll need to build education systems that have to be more resilient, right? But being more resilient implies that education has to be a continuum from the school to the home, right? But to have a better educational process at home, right? You need to have better conditions at home. You need to have more connectivity, right? You have to have cheaper internet connections, the zero rate that David was mentioning. But also you need to have parents that are really prepared to be a real support to the education process of their children, right? So there's a lot that we can build on, right? In terms of the technology side, in terms of the teacher side, in terms of the role of parents and communities, right? So really we can use this, right, as a basis for systems that could be more equal, right, and systems that could be more resilient and more impactful, right, in terms of the quality of the education for our kids.
I'm mindful of the clock, but just briefly, you mentioned teachers there. The pandemic's been very, very hard on teachers. You know, they've had to innovate. They've been out of the classroom. They've obviously had their own health concerns. If you're speaking to a young person who's thinking of becoming a teacher, what would you talk to them about, you know, a life in service, a life in public service, a life in education, whether that be in the government side, whether that be as a teacher? What would you say to them? Jaime, I'll start with Jaime.
Also, I think David as well is a champion of bringing more people to public service, particularly young people to public service. And actually, when I was in the other side of the table, when I was in David's shoes and when I was Minister of Education of my country in Peru, a key priority was to inspire young people, right, to support the education systems of their countries. And there are many ways in which people can do that. What you were saying, right? The teachers play the fundamental role, right? A good education system is as good as their teachers, right? And we all know that teachers play we all remember, right, by name, right, that teacher, that person that 30, 40, 50 years ago said something while we were in school that changed our lives, right? So that's just an example, right, of how important every one of us in this call, well, we remember by name that teacher, right? So the teacher really can change the lives of a child or a young person. But it's not only teachers, right? It's the people who work in the Ministry of Education, right? It's what we call the bureaucrats, right? That sometimes is a word that has a kind of even have a negative connotation. But those bureaucrats, right, can really, right, with well-designed policies and in the process of implementing policies, right? And these examples that Dave was mentioned, their policies are difficult to implement in the field, on the ground, right? For that, you need bureaucrats that are committed, right? And we really see, I have seen, right, a lot of commitment of many young people, right, that understand that they really can make a difference on the lives of children, of young people, through education, right? I think we are privileged to work in education, right? Because I think sometimes it's easier to see how can you change really the life of a teacher, of a parent, or a student.
And David, just because we're running out of time, one thing I want to get your opinion on is this idea of life in public service, and life, be it as an educator, be it in government. What would you say when you go around the country and you talk to young students? What do you talk to them about?
I mean, I think yesterday I was in about 2 schools with the First Lady, who was providing sanitary kits to girls, and I told them I was honored to be there. And often it's one of these things where the young person feels like they are the honored ones to receive guests. And I mean, I'm still young as well, so it's like I would like talking to like young people. And I think I do sit in a space where I can be honored both for being there and also feel honored to be there. And it really is because I do believe I can see that they could each grow to fulfill their potential. And we recently changed our vision within the Ministry of Education since I came here, that that kids and young learners can access from basic all the way to high technical, the quality education that allows them to fulfill their potential, because it's about their potential, to participate in local and global economy and civic life, because that's what the whole point about life is. I think economy, civic life, and self-actualization. And I think as a young person in service, it can be lonely, it can be stressful, it can be too much, because there's lots of, like, you're never, anything you do, there's a criticism. You can't be, if you do something, you do it too much, it's a problem. You do that too much. But I think my takeaway from all of this is, because we're young is why we should be in public service. And because we are who we are, it means we have to chart our own cause, not for ourselves, but for the future, because the future will still be part of it. When we think about the future, my grandfather, future, he's thinking about the future of his grandchildren, right? My children. But if I think about my future, it's me in it still, interacting with my children. So I think we have to chart our own cause, be radical, be bold, know that it comes with a lot of stress in service, and being of service comes with its challenges, because people have not seen people like us before in service. So it's also new to them. And I think that's linked to what Jaime was saying, and that there has to be a lot more. It's not just the teachers, it's not just the parents, it's everybody that has to support our leaders and our public servants.
And you talked there about being young, and I'm gonna underline that and say we're all very young here, but when we're older and wiser in the decades to come, and we're having a coffee on the porch in our rocking chairs, and we're talking and we're looking back at this crisis, I'm curious y'all's view. Is this going to be a moment that was this kind of massive, major setback, or is it this massive leap forward in terms of innovation around education? And maybe I'll start with you, David, and then we'll go to Jaime to close us out.
I was just reading, actually, what's its name? I have a book that I have in my bag here. It's called COVID-19, The Great Reset by Klaus. And I just started it, and I like it because it's saying that they think about the new normal. There's nothing normal. There was nothing all right about the world that we lived in. And when I take it to education, and I say this, look, education was for a few people. Over the last couple of years or decades in Sieralleone, for you to access education, you had to be in an urban area. And if you're a boy, maybe it was better for you. But if you're a rural, poor girl, your chances are you didn't really have access to quality education. And the realities were that we lived in a very unequal world. And this crisis has told us that is not okay. It's not cool that we've had so much inequality in the world. So we don't want to go to normal. And it really is that maybe it's a reset. It's a great reset for all of us to be like, wait a minute, let's pause here. The world that's not how we wanted the world. And we can pause with all our lock-ins and time at home, reflect in the mirror, and say that's not what we wanted. And I think in education, it's the moment with which we have to say, no. The quality education for 2.5 people is not good enough. Quality is also by ensuring that all 6 million children in your country, all 3 million children in your country have access to education that will enable them to be full, functional, participating citizens. And I think that's the great reset for me in the sector.
Realize their fullest potential. Jaime, your thought here, major setback, big leap forward. What's your view? Close us out.
I think we need to see this as a turning point because the trend that we were going through was not the right one. The right one because half of the kids in the world were just not learning, even if they were in school, right? So we were already living a learning crisis, and we were already, even before the pandemic, in an extremely unequal world, right? It was a world that it was immorally unjust and unfair, right? And unfortunately, this pandemic has made all those things worse, right? Because the learning crisis is even larger and inequality is even larger, right? So, and we need to internalize that, right? We need to understand that if there was a crisis, now it's worse because of the pandemic, But this is the right opportunity. This is the opportunity in which we need to build then on those lessons, right? And take really education seriously, right? And actually put all the political and financial and management commitment, right, that it's needed, right, in order to give the right education to everyone, right? And it's really not rocket science, right? It's not that we just don't know. We have no clue how a good school is. We know how it is, right? It's really not impossible, but you really need to have that revision of our social contract, right? In which we collectively say, look, it is tremendously unfair, right, that a girl in rural Sierra does not have the same opportunities like a girl in Paris. Everyone should have exactly that same opportunity in terms of education, independently of where you were born, what's your color, what's your gender, what's the wealth of your parents. We're not there yet, right? This is the opportunity, right? We have the lessons, right? We just need to put that political and financial and managerial commitment, right? That is crucial, and I think it's doable, right? If we have more leaders like David with that level of commitment, I think this is doable.
It gives me a lot of hope that you guys are finding and looking for all these opportunities amid the crisis. Afraid though we're out of time. The whistle's blowing, but I appreciate you guys taking the time to be here on World Bank Live this morning. Really, really grateful for you guys taking the time.
Thanks, Paul, and great to see you, David.
Thank you.
Hopefully I'll be there soon.
David Singay is the Minister for Basic and Secondary Education for the government of Sierra Leone. He joined us from Freetown in Sierra Leone. And Jaime Saavedra is the World Bank's Global Director for Education. He joined us from Lima, Peru. I mentioned at the top of the program that the World Bank is tracking the education crisis, and we have a near real-time dashboard of school closures and the status of schools around the world. You can find that on the education section of the World Bank website. And if you want to learn more about the World Bank's work on the COVID-19 response, head on over to worldbank.org/coronavirus. I'm Paul Blake. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. We'll see you back here again soon. Goodbye.